Exactly 11:18 p.m., March 7, 2026, at Isfahan Air Base. A squadron of 10 F-7 fighters had just landed after a nearly 2-hour patrol over central Iran. The aircraft taxied one by one toward the eastern apron, where several F-14 Tomcats and dozens of other aircraft were already parked. The pilots stepped out of their cockpits in a relaxed state. On the apron, the aircraft were still radiating heat, their engines not yet cooled after the long sortie. And they likely never would. Because from 37 miles away, an attack formation was already closing in. The strike package, part of Operation Roaring Lion, consisted of 8 Israeli aircraft. Leading the formation were 4 F-35I Adir, flying at medium altitude, emitting no active signals and relying entirely on passive sensors to observe the battle space. Behind them were 4 F-15I carrying precision-guided munitions and serving as the primary strike element. On the edges of the formation, 2 F-16I Sufa operated as suppression support, ready to engage any radar that lit up. The entire flight path had been planned over months of intelligence collection, exploiting mountainous terrain and narrow valleys to avoid radar detection. Iran believed its S-300 PMU-2, Bavar 373, and radar network around Isfahan were impenetrable. Tonight, that assumption would collapse. For more than 435 miles prior, the Israeli formation had flown in complete radio silence. No active radar emissions, no conventional radio communication. All data exchange was conducted through encrypted internal links, minimizing the chance of detection. At just over 18 miles out, Iranian radar stations began detecting faint anomalies at the edge of their scan zones. To investigate, several systems switched to active mode, increasing transmission power in an attempt to identify targets. The moment those emissions appeared, the 2 F-16I Sufa on the flanks immediately registered the signal sources. Within seconds, they launched anti-radiation missiles toward those emitters, forcing Iranian radar stations to shut down or reduce power to avoid destruction. Simultaneously, the F-35I initiated short bursts of high-intensity electronic jamming. Iranian radar displays filled with false targets, dense electronic noise that prevented any stable lock. At that point, Iran's air defense network was still operational, but it had effectively lost control of the sky. The Israeli formation held course, advancing directly toward the base without encountering meaningful resistance. At approximately 9 miles from the target, Iranian Air Defense Command finally recognized the situation as a real attack. An emergency intercept order was issued. S-300 PMU-2 systems launched multiple long-range missiles. Short-range Tor-M1 systems activated simultaneously, forming a dense defensive ring along the expected release axis. But the F-35I had already anticipated this. They deployed multiple MALDJ decoys and activated maximum jamming output. Within a critical 30-second window, S-300 guidance radars were completely disrupted. Most missiles lost lock, self-destructed midair, or veered off course. Several Tor-M1 missiles attempted to engage, but the F-35s executed high-G maneuvers while deploying heavy chaff and flares, breaking all tracking attempts. Every missile was defeated before reaching the Israeli formation. At 5 miles out, the strike package transitioned into its pre-planned fixed target engagement profile. The F-35I Adir maintained lead, continuing electronic suppression and monitoring residual emissions. Behind them, the F-15I stabilized along the release axis, while the F-16I Sufa spread outward to engage secondary targets such as radar and SAM positions. At approximately 12,000 feet, 2 F-15I opened their bays and released precision-guided weapons, GBU-31 JDAM and Spice 2000 bombs separated at an initial speed of roughly 485 miles per hour, accelerating along their ballistic trajectories as they descended toward the target. All were programmed to strike the eastern apron, where aircraft were parked in tight formation, fully exposed, with no hardened shelters or spacing, an ideal condition for maximum blast and fire propagation. The first impacts occurred almost simultaneously. One JDAM penetrated the mid-fuselage of a Grumman F-14 Tomcat, detonating internally and generating a massive fireball within seconds. A spice bomb struck the wing and engine of a neighboring F-14, tearing apart its structure and scattering debris across the apron. Two additional bombs impacted adjacent parking positions, expanding the kill zone across the clustered aircraft. Shockwaves and fire spread rapidly. More than 10 aircraft, including Chengdu F-7, J-7, and several McDonnell F-4 Phantom II, were destroyed or severely damaged by fragmentation and secondary explosions. Fuel spilled across the concrete surface, ignited instantly, and triggered cascading fires that linked multiple parking areas into a single expanding inferno. At the same time, F-16I aircraft conducted follow-up strikes on infrastructure. Precision munitions hit taxiways and shelter entrances, creating fractures and craters sufficient to completely disrupt ground operations. A fire control radar and at least one nearby SAM position were also struck, further degrading remaining defenses. In less than 90 seconds, the entire eastern apron was engulfed in flames. Temperatures at the blast centers exceeded 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Residual engine heat from recently landed aircraft accelerated fire spread, producing a cascading domino effect. Isfahan Air Base descended into chaos. Sirens echoed across the facility. Floodlights swept erratically. Fire crews rushed in, but extreme heat and the risk of secondary explosions from fuel and munitions forced them to pull back dozens of yards. Base command ordered all runways closed, declared full red alert, and instructed remaining air defense units to engage at maximum capacity. It was already too late. The Israeli formation completed its mission and withdrew safely along pre-planned corridors. F-35I aircraft continued providing electronic cover, while F-16I engaged any radar attempting to reactivate. The outcome was clear. Iran lost 2 to 3 F-14 Tomcats, possibly the last operational units at the base, along with more than 10 additional aircraft. Runways, shelters, radar systems, and multiple SAM positions sustained significant damage. But the impact extended far beyond the physical destruction of the eastern apron. Satellite imagery comparisons before and after the strike showed at least 2 to 3 Grumman F-14 Tomcats completely destroyed, along with more than 10 additional aircraft. Cracks and damage across taxiways and apron areas indicated severe disruption to ground operations, limiting short-term recovery capability. At the tactical level, the loss of the F-14 meant the loss of Iran's last operational long-range interception platform. For years, the F-14 had functioned as a flying radar, capable of detecting and controlling airspace far beyond the capabilities of F-7 or F-4 aircraft. With those airframes removed, Iran lost its airborne early warning layer. The chain of detection to tracking to interception was significantly compressed, forcing reliance on ground-based radar, systems already exposed as vulnerable to electronic warfare. At the operational level, the consequences were even more severe. Isfahan served as a critical hub for force rotation and sustainment in central Iran. With the eastern apron disabled, immediate sortie generation capacity dropped sharply. Aircraft had to be dispersed to secondary bases, increasing response times and logistical strain. Even surviving aircraft faced deployment delays due to damaged taxiways and restricted access routes. At the strategic level, the psychological impact was unmistakable. For years, Isfahan's air defense network, anchored by S-300 PMU-2 and Bavar 373, was considered one of the most heavily defended zones in Iran. Yet a small formation penetrated, suppressed, and struck high-value targets without losses. This was not just a material loss. It was a loss of operational confidence, one that directly affects how commanders make decisions in future engagements. Initial Iranian statements acknowledged only limited damage, even suggesting that the targets hit were decoys or non-operational assets. However, independent sources, including satellite imagery and OSINT analysis, indicated significantly greater destruction. Commercial satellite images released within 24 to 48 hours showed large burn scars precisely at the eastern apron, along with debris patterns forming elliptical distributions, consistent with precision-guided bomb strikes. Comparison with pre-strike imagery revealed that former parking positions of F-14 Tomcats had been completely replaced by scorched zones and twisted metal debris. No evidence suggested prior relocation or decoy deployment. OSINT analysis further reinforced this conclusion. By examining shadow angles, debris shapes, and burn propagation patterns, multiple independent groups confirmed that at least 2 F-14 airframes were destroyed in place, with more than 10 additional aircraft heavily damaged or beyond recovery. Some imagery also captured fractures across taxiways and apron zones, indicating that the strike targeted not only aircraft, but the entire operational infrastructure. Meanwhile, Israeli statements emphasized strike effectiveness, confirming that high-value targets, including F-14s, had been neutralized. Although details remained limited, the timing and wording suggested a deliberate messaging strategy aimed at reinforcing perceptions of technological superiority and precision strike capability. What makes this strike significant goes far beyond the number of destroyed aircraft. It lies in the nature of those F-14s themselves. These were aircraft designed, built, and sold by the United States to Iran in the 1970s, when Tehran was still a strategic ally of Washington. At the time, the F-14 Tomcat represented the pinnacle of Western air combat technology, a long-range interceptor with powerful radar, high speed, and unmatched airspace control. Nearly half a century later, those same airframes, once symbols of American air power, were destroyed on the ground by a strike package built on the same technological ecosystem. That is the coldest irony of Isfahan. These aircraft survived the Islamic Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, decades of sanctions, and years of spare part shortages, kept alive through improvised maintenance and cannibalization. For years, Iran sustained them by stripping parts from one airframe to keep another operational, turning each surviving Tomcat into a technical miracle rather than a modern combat platform. But on the night of March 7, 2026, that miracle ended, and it ended in the most ironic way possible. A symbol of American military aviation was destroyed by precision-guided bombs, strike aircraft, and an electronic warfare system, also rooted in American military technology. Viewed across history, this was more than an airstrike. It was the closing of a strategic loop. The F-14 had once been sold to Iran as a shield against Soviet threats. Nearly 50 years later, it became a burned-out wreck under strikes guided by F-35I, F-15I, JDAM, and the full doctrine of modern Western SEAD. A weapon that once represented the peak of American power was not defeated by an equal rival. It was erased by the next generation of the same system that created it. For Iran, the F-14 was never just an aircraft. It was a symbol of a time when its air force stood on equal footing with Western powers. It was the final remnant of a US-style air doctrine still embedded within the IRIAF. And when those Tomcats turned into twisted metal on the Isfahan apron, what collapsed was not just aging airframes, but the illusion that Iran still retained a piece of that legacy. That is why the night of March 7, 2026 did not just mark the loss of an airbase. It marked the end of a legend,